Well, hi all. Thanks for staying with us on Friday afternoon, at least in California. Um, and I'm very pleased to facilitate this particular panel because what could be better on a Friday afternoon than a series of success stories? Um, Really, yet another excellent panel. Nicole Capretz is the CEO of Climate Action Campaign, and I'll also note that she's a longtime public member of the Strategic Growth Council. Rex Parris is the mayor of the city of Lancaster, and Dan Kammen, among many other things, is distinguished professor of energy at UC Berkeley and soon at Johns Hopkins. So I am going to be a consumer of this panel for the most part, and I'll just move from speaker to speaker, and we'll start off with Nicole.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Ken. I hear an echo. Is that just me?
I hear it as well,
Yeah, so do I.
but just with you. Nobody else is echoing.
Should I just keep going? Regardless of the echo?
I wonder, do you have a speaker on or something?
Or you can start. So it's just me. I'm the problem. Is that?
I'm not hearing an echo from anybody.
Okay. Okay. So do you want to start maybe with Rex, and I'll try something.
Amelia, can you put up Rex's?
Oh, is my lobby open? Sorry about that.
Hang on a sec. That's probably what it is.
Let's see. How do I figure that out?
Close that tab.
Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry for holding things up.
Oh,
You may
you're
have
not.
a window open from listening to prior sessions.
Yeah, I don't think I hear your echo anymore.
It's gone.
How's this? Is that better?
Yeah, you're
Okay, sorry about that. I was listening to prior sessions as much as I could. But thanks, Ken, and happy to be here today. I have mentioned that I've been listening in as much as I can, and I've really learned a lot. I've enjoyed the speakers, and I'm particularly pleased about being on this panel because I run an organization, community-based organization in Southern California that mostly focuses on mitigation. And I think, I put in this slide, the single most important resiliency measure is mitigation, because we can't resiliency our way out of the climate crisis. We have to transition off fossil fuels. And so I just want to make sure that's elevated and emphasized, because I did note, and somebody else in an earlier session echoed the sentiment, but the majority of this conference has been about resiliency. And well, of course, that's extremely important. That is the focus of this convening. We just don't want to forget that we still have this beast in front of us, which is figuring out how to piece by piece remove fossil fuels from the economy. I also want to point out that that is so critically important, not just from a reducing emissions perspective, but also because people are actively being harmed every single day from fossil fuel pollution. Air pollution is just a continuing challenge and threat to livelihood and health. And the latest statistic shows that air pollution reduces the average person's lifespan by almost 2 years, and is now more deadly than war and smoking and TB. And so I just want to continue to remind everybody that we have to just singularly focus on getting off fossil fuels. So I'm just going to highlight some of what's been happening in San Diego. That's where the majority of my organization's work has been. We are 10 years old, and my particular story is that I was in the city of San Diego mayor's office 10 years ago, and I had the opportunity to write the city's climate action plan. And it became this groundbreaking document that got international attention. But the first thing I knew from being on the inside of politics is that we didn't have community will around it, and we didn't quite have all the stakeholders that we needed in order to sustain the policies that were in that climate plan. And so I left government and launched this nonprofit organization. And so our whole goal has been, how do we make sure that this is that we are building community will, and thus building political will, and we are creating the conditions for success. So the city of San Diego's climate plan got majority of attention because they were the first top 10 US city to require reaching 100% renewable energy on the grid by 2035. So the spotlight was on San Diego, and the question, of course, next was, well, how are you going to get there? Because during the climate plan community process, SDG&E was actively opposed and said, it's not possible to get to 100%, and we're not going to get you there. And so that became the starting point and the launch of the fight for community choice. And there were other community choice programs in Northern California that existed. So it's not that we were breaking new ground, but we had pretty fierce opposition from Sempra. They invested shareholder dollars. It was a 5-year fight, but now San Diego has 2 very stable, effective community choice programs, San Diego Community Power and Clean Energy Alliance. So they represent almost 85% of the population in the region, which is about almost 3 million people. So these are 2 very large community choice programs who will have a lot of opportunity for innovation and change and keeping pressure down on the price. I think that's one of the unheralded qualities about community choice programs is that they are building all of these reserves, and those reserves can actually be used to reduce rates, and which is obviously something we are all grappling with is cost of living and affordability. So just one of the many beauties of these nonprofit public power agencies. So we have these community choice programs that are thriving, and I wanted to highlight the County of San Diego because they've been very conservative for the majority of my career in politics over the last 30 years. And then over the last 5 years, suddenly we had pretty blue wave, and we have progressive board of supervisors for the very first time. And out of that, we have a climate action plan. But the thing to note, I think, is they are struggling and grappling with the challenge of land use and how they should tackle the housing crisis while being very mindful of the challenges with sprawl and what the implications are with sprawl. And obviously don't need to say in today's environment, the problem with building in high fire risk areas. San Diego is very, very, very high fire risk. And we're the community that had that first devastating fires way back in the 2005, 2006, where thousands of homes were lost and people were displaced. So we are intimately familiar with what that recovery, the reality of that recovery, how challenging it is. So now I just kind of want to point out that there is a lot of pressure on the county to build anywhere and everywhere, despite any of the challenges with building in these, in the backcountry without the infrastructure in these high fire risk areas, despite the homeowners insurance crisis that's just escalating. And now we're hearing about how the bond market is responding to the threat of the climate crisis, which is downgrading ratings and increasing the cost of borrowing money. So there's just so many ripple effects and challenges to sprawl. And I just want to note the County of San Diego is we don't have a final answer on that. And we haven't even really addressed the VMT rules the state has. And so that's just an ongoing battle that I think is, kind of dual mitigation and resiliency. And the Port of San Diego is, I would say, an incredible success story. And I know that's a lot of partnership with the state and in the past, the federal government, but they really have electrified almost all of their operations just from front to back. And they have, I think, the first they have the first electric tugboat in the United States. And they are just moving forward at rapid speed to try to be a model and try to reduce the pollution impact on all the portside communities in partnership with the communities. And I think it's really a model. And I know the other ports, LA and Long Beach, are similarly doing really important work. But I do think the ports are kind of a shining light and a shining star. And they seem to have the political will and the community will that we're sort of not seeing as strong right now in the cities. So kudos to the port for all the work that they are doing to electrify their equipment and operations. Oh, the port also has the solar microgrid, which is all about resiliency and reliability because they understand what could happen if the grid goes down to our economy. And then the next slide is focused on our school districts. We've had incredible success. All these efforts are ground up, but going to each school district and saying, hey, why don't you be part of the solution and let's electrify your buildings? Because again, we do not, there's just been a lot of legal challenges, a lot of struggles with how do we kind of at scale decarbonize buildings. It's just, as everybody knows, the gas industry is putting up a valiant fight to stop that progress. And so we've had great success in just going to these school districts because the students feel really passionate about climate and health, and they have active clubs. And so we partner with those clubs. So San Diego Unified, Sweetwater Unified, Carlsbad, there's all sorts of there are a lot of other school districts who are on tap and have called us and said, we want to do the same. So they are committing to electrifying all their new buildings because a lot of these school districts have bond money. Like if you saw in the last election, I think we all voted on a lot of bonds for schools. So there's a lot of construction happening at these schools. So I'm really excited to see that these buildings are going to be all electric, and then they have retrofitting policies as well. And obviously it's end of service life and it's got to make sense. But we're seeing, I think, more movement, frankly, in the buildings, and they own a lot of properties at schools than we are at cities or other local governments. So I also just wanted to highlight the opportunities at school districts. And then kind of the overarching point is, I think in the last session, there was kind of a question about, well, what if somebody's on the inside or there's staff turnover and, it's like somebody's lower on the food chain within a bureaucracy, like how do you keep these efforts front and center? How do you, how do you elevate their priority? I cannot emphasize enough as someone who's spent many years on the inside and on the outside, almost equal, that you partner with community-based organizations. There is nothing more effective than having a loud and organized and consistent presence by local community-based organizations, especially frontline organizations who, again, are fighting for their health and having daily immediate impacts to their health and livelihood. It's an ecosystem we're all operating in, and I haven't really heard community-based organizations being lifted up in this convening, but I'm telling you, like, they are your secret sauce because electeds, the community-based organizations can obviously, they have a lot of opportunity to influence the electeds. And so please, if you're still on this session from the last session, and you're wondering, how do you make change happen? Of course, we want to integrate and include local academic institutions and other local governments, but at the same time, there's just nothing like having a trusted messenger, community-based organization who is leading. And then, of course, the other important note is that when efforts are community-driven, you get more sustained support and more sustained success. Because again, if these communities have been partnering with the local government in designing and developing these rules and regulations or these policies, they are more invested in its success. And so just speaking to, how do we make sure that these changes are everlasting? So those are the areas that I know we have a short amount of time, Ken. So I just wanted to highlight kind of the successes we've had with mitigation. And I am proud of San Diego for the last 10 years, kind of where we're at. But at the end of the day, I also just want to highlight we're not on track to hit the goals. And I know that's true of the whole state, and I know it's a struggle and it's going to get even harder. But don't forget that community-based organizations are here to partner with you, local governments, and we're committed, and we have so many passionate members and community and students, and there's the unions. I mean, there's so many opportunities that we can still make progress, and we look forward to doing that with everybody.
Let me ask you a super quick question, particularly around the school districts. If there are others outside of the San Diego area who want to get some advice on how you've managed to do that, I'm assuming they can contact you and your organization.
Please. Yeah, I kind of teased it. I was saying we definitely work with the clubs, the schools that have environmental or climate-based or health clubs. And then, yes, but you're right. There's a whole blueprint, and we're happy to share with anybody because it's been, frankly, so much easier than cities just to make progress and to get things done. And it's probably just a function of how they're set up. But regardless, we want to keep pushing and having success stories. And I think schools are a place to do that.
Perfect. All right, so let's move on to Mayor Parris.
You're actually on mute.
I give a much better presentation on mute. Lancaster was the first city in California. I think we were actually the first city in the world to put more electrons on the grid than we take. And that was, I think, 2015 that we achieved that goal. During that journey, we learned a lot of things along the way. One of the things we did is we brought BYD from China together with KB Homes from the US and asked them to create a house that was affordable and net zero, that would store the energy. They assured me that it was not possible to do that. 6 months later, we flipped the switch on the house that did exactly that. Since then, KB Homes is now doing, we call it 2.0 houses. You know, it really was not, we didn't have the technology at that time to make it so it was affordable. I mean, you could do it, but they just weren't affordable. And KB Homes, you know, they were on the abyss of bankruptcy when they did it too. They redesigned their houses. And, you know, they really had to do that. You have to redesign the attic, you got to redesign a lot of the house. But they created the first net zero house and people moved in, and the amount of money they pay at the end of the month is much less, you know, because you don't have the electric bill. They also were able to reduce the gas the house used by a third and the water by a third. You know, that opened up that creative process. That was over 10 years ago. You know, since then we've moved on. While we were doing that also, all of our schools, you know, the city funded the solar, you know, and I think we're coming to the end of those leases now. Our stadium, everything in the city was powered by solar, and it was remarkably easy to do, although we didn't think so when we set out to do it. It just, you know, and the reason it was so easy, and keep in mind, Lancaster is a Republican city. I'm a Republican. It's a very conservative city. You know, how was I able to do this? Well, it's really actually pretty simple. It's cheaper. Of course it's cheaper. You know, we're talking about drilling 30,000 feet into the earth versus taking it from the sun for free. Once the infrastructure's in place, it is cheaper. You know, it's just a question of amortizing it. And as soon as I was able to get that message out, I didn't know it when we started. I mean, but when I figured that out, you know, it became very easy. We had the community choice aggregate. We started that. Our city, I believe, has the best bond rating in LA County. When I started, it had the worst. I mean, it is a poor area. It is not San Diego. You know, it's a whole different income base. But our bond rating's the best. We have a reserve of 40%. In fact, we struggle figuring out the best way to spend the money. We don't have struggles that there is no money, you know, and we rely on technology. That brought us into contact with the Japanese, who are developing hydrogen in a very big way, and we formed partnerships. And if we could move on to the next slide. The next one. And we formed First Public H2. And we have agreements now in place that for 40 tons of hydrogen, all we need to, what we're doing now is aggregating the customers. You know, somebody needs 500 tons, somebody needs this, you know, it's all smaller markets. You got to aggregate them to get the fields built because these are billion-dollar investments. But we already set aside the land, we've zoned it, we've got the plans in place, we're ready to break ground, and we'll be doing it through First Public H2. The thing we are facing now is a different administration who has very different views, you know. But what I would caution people is the language I use and the language the council uses. We don't talk about climate change. We talk about climate extinction. I mean, call it what it is, for heaven's sakes. You know, we use climate change. Well, it's supposed to change. It changes every winter and every summer, you know. I mean, it doesn't resonate with people. What does resonate with people is lowering their electric bill. Right now, I have people dying during the summer because they can't afford to turn on their air conditioner. How is that possible in America? But that is the case. And we have to recognize that California is much different than other states. You know, at peak times, other states are paying 11 cents. We're paying 40 some cents. You know, the cost of electricity in California is much, much higher. And so hydrogen fuel cells make absolute sense. Absolute sense. You know, we can cut that bill in half, we think, once we get the fuel cells installed and the hydrogen production up and running. The and I guess the message I have from a city's point of view is, oh, you know, instead of just telling you what we did, let me tell you a little bit about how we did it. We have a lot of different agencies. You know, we have a transportation agency, we have the air quality management district, we have all those things that you have. Right? But I put one person on all of them. You know, instead of multiple people on all of them, my vice mayor is on every one of those boards. And so as a result, we can trade. You know, like the Antelope Valley Transportation Agency. We get the least funding from the county, but we're the only profitable transportation agency in America. The only one. How do we do that? Carbon credits, because every one of our buses have been electrified now for, I think, over 6 years. And we will be moving to hydrogen buses eventually. But it requires interweaving all of these different agencies with a unified purpose. You know, as soon as these are all Republicans. Remember that. I mean, you know, I'm not talking about people with the will to go after the fossil fuel industry. But what they do have the will for is lowering costs, lowering the cost of power into their homes and into their vehicles. And when you show them how this pencils out, they're there. You know, I don't have any resistance. I'm not aware of any resistance in that community of moving to a totally free of fossil fuels. I am a little surprised that I'm talking to this group. It must be because Sempra is not sponsoring you. You know, Sempra started sponsoring these presentations, and I was taken off the list. You know, because I call them what they are. They have killed more people than any serial killer in American history, and they're continuing to do it. I mean, what just happened in Los Angeles? You know, they can point fingers everywhere, but the truth is they didn't turn off the power. Something hit those lines and caused that fire, and you know it's going to be 20 years before we recover from that. We should recognize who the enemy is because it is an enemy. Make no mistake about that. The but you know, I'm also changing the way we talk elsewhere. I mean, I know the group here, so I'm a little freer in how I'm talking. You know, the Trump administration has come out and said they want to power AI, and they need 2 to 3 times the power we have today to do that. Well, hasn't anybody looked at the fact that the grid is at maximum capacity now? How do you rebuild a grid to accommodate those electrons? You don't. But what you can do is you can repurpose electrons. If we started doing microgrids and we powered neighborhoods with fuel cells and all the other things we could be doing, they now have electrons to use for the AI servers, which I think are a great idea. I think that, you know, we absolutely need to do that. I am encouraged that, you know, the world's view has changed a little bit about nuclear. I mean, there are nuclear projects now that are far safer than anything that occurred in the past. You know, we have to be open to other people's what motivates other people to do this. You know, I don't necessarily care what I believe. You know, I care what they believe. And how does their belief system make this go faster. Because most people, even young Republicans now, and I stress young, recognize it is climate extinction. And our grandchildren will die from it if we don't do something. I haven't found it that hard to do something. All I find that the difficulty is the lack of organization. My wife and I were blessed with an incredibly successful law firm, so I can invest a lot of money into the local politics and keep everybody on the same path in this. However you have to do that is how you have to do it. Because if you don't have that unified purpose, it just takes so long to make any changes at all. When we did the net zero house, KB Homes, their biggest concern was how long is it going to take to permit this? So I looked at my watch and said, how long do you want it to take? The city councils give building permits. The mayors are in charge of building permits. We need to recognize that in Lancaster, we just do not allow anything to stand in the way of energy efficient businesses that come to town. One day I found out that it was taking 6 months to get a building permit to put solar panels on your house. So I sent an email. From now on, it takes 45 minutes. That's it, and now you just do it over the internet. It takes less than 45 minutes. Most of the obstacles we have are just antiquated business models, antiquated ways of doing things. I just haven't found it. I like to say it's not rocket science, but I guess it really is. But we just make. I guess I want to conclude with this. Start using the language they use. Quit using the language you use. This is not about who's right or wrong. This is about saving our grandchildren. And I'm prepared to do whatever I have to do and to use whatever words I have to use to get us there. And think of all of us have the same view here. Why is it so hard to bring everyone together on it? It shouldn't be. And with that, I guess I'm, a little bit now about Lancaster.
Yeah, thank you for that. We have not been successful in convincing people, so hearing what you have to say about using language differently is right on point. Dan, over to you.
Well, that's pretty inspiring. I have to say, hearing what Lancaster's done from a poor economic base really kind of excites me, because my comments really flow from that in a bunch of ways. So if we could put the slides up. I want to say thanks, and I wish we were doing this in person. Both strike issues and perhaps some bad news coming from Rome and the Vatican have kept us doing it remotely, but at least we can meet up this way. So what I'll try to highlight is really doubling down on some of the things you've heard from both Nicole and Rex about how to really do it in practice, but also a push for some of the critical areas where we need to do more. And we need to do more both at home in California and more globally. So next slide. If anybody wants to follow the work that I'll talk about, there's the website of my own laboratory at Berkeley, where we work on a number of these topics. And then now that people are transitioning to Blue Sky, I guess that's the new current alternative. That's the link for generally a tweet a day from the laboratory. And so I'll try to highlight comments, but you can find all the materials both on Blue Sky and on the website. So next slide. It shouldn't come as any surprise that we're in a really challenging time. And so as someone who is actually in DC right now, I've now been to a few Department of Energy and White House briefings, it is a world that is so foreign to a lot of the conversations in California, along the lines that Mayor Parris said about thinking about our children and grandchildren. It's really scary. And so the idea that we're going to devote the Department of Energy at the federal level, the EPA, the remaining employees at NOAA and USAID, if they even still exist, to some form of energy dominance as opposed to some partnership around the planet for mutual gain is really pretty scary. The Musk Doji Agency is one that one should take seriously because it will affect all the things we're doing. And this slightly humorous picture of this bald eagle staring at the fossil fuels on Titan is unfortunately kind of a sign of where we are in terms of thinking about greed and not about the fact that we all co-inhabit this spaceship together. So I'll try to give one quick example about activities in California and one global example. And the reason to do that is that California is now less than 1% of global emissions. That doesn't mean we don't have significant issues here about how to pay for the transitions, about making sure it's green hydrogen, about making sure that energy access is equitable. But the programs that have been started in California are really essentially a story of how California is the anti-Las Vegas. What starts in California doesn't end in California. And I'm going to try to highlight that in a couple of ways. And so everyone working in clean energy, both on the mitigation side, as Nicole said, we have to cut our emissions to zero, and the adaptation side, dealing with that which I've already committed to is critical. And you'll see that it's not just that solar and batteries have gotten 90% cheaper in the last decade, and that wind has gotten 60% cheaper. It's that these forecasts, those gray lines that you see, continually underappreciate and under-recognize just how quickly clean energy is both improving in efficiency, dropping in price. And a lot of that is due to the thanks of the technology innovation push, of which California is a big part, which the US is a big part still, and we'll see going forward, and the manufacturing and deployment with a great deal of this in China. And so we have to think about our international partnerships. But I highlight this because what you see here is that year after year, the forecasts dramatically underestimate what's happening. And a lot of that is due to policies in California. So if we're less than 1% of emissions, we need to think about how we can really leverage that more dramatically going forward, because we're going to need to get to 100% and show that we can do it in the way that Mayor Parris said, at or below forecasted cost, not over cost. And so next slide gives us kind of an example picture going forward. And you can see the energy transitions going back now well over 150 years have been ones where the jockeying among the thermal energy sources is largely giving way to clean energy. The rise of solar, California, for example, the world's 5th largest economy, can now meet its average demand just with solar on a good spring day, about half of what we need on those hot August, September days. But the huge push at the federal level towards a push back into fossil fuels is something that we are going to see in a lot of levels. And so this is not at all guaranteed, even with the remarkable fact that it's now cheaper to build a new clean energy power plant than it is to operate an existing plant. And that's wonderful news. But the fact that we globally subsidize fossil fuels more than we total invest in renewables means that this is a wonderful path, but it's got a lot of uncertainties. And so California is going to have to push ahead for its own citizens, but also the global picture. So let me give you one kind of version of translating that into locally obtainable, actionable projects. So next slide. So this kind of highlights some of the places where the California ideas about making transportation a critical part of our climate agenda, something that many people here are working on. And in fact, now emissions are a large part of our total, to working with our vehicle fleets. And next slide, just to show an example of this moving forward. And here is a block funded by the California Public Utilities Commission. And this is a 40-home residence in Oakland. It's called the Eco Block. And it's a project to collectively install solar, but instead of doing it home by home, to make it a shared effort where the solar is pooled into that gray battery that you see. And then it goes back to supply all the homes. as well as shared EVs on the block, charged at open stations like a zip car, and then what's left to be then sold back to the utility. And I highlight this eco block because it's the kind of model that not only accelerates the deployment, but also does something critical, and that is to recognize and center equity and justice, and not just make it about clean energy for the affluent. In my remaining 2 minutes, let me just give an international example, a place where Berkeley is a key player. Next slide, please. And this is a recognition that, for example, in Africa, more than 70% of all the health clinics, about 100,000, do not have access to clean energy, but all of the same solar technologies and inverters and advanced meters that we can use here can be put together in the kind of mini grids that Mayor Parris highlighted. And so this is a global consortium with a goal to provide mini grids at 25,000 health clinics by the end of this year, a goal we will meet, and then ultimately 100,000 clinics with partnerships with all of these UN and private sector and university groups that you see here. And just on the final slide, just showing a kind of a montage of a collective design process, taking advantage of the latest solar panels, recognizing there's justice issues in the materials in solar panels, that we can use low-cost advanced sensors in these poorest situations, as well as in the fanciest Piedmont and Beverly Hills communities, and leverage that to not only provide healthcare, but also to overbuild these systems so they can become the same kind of mini grids that we're seeing in Arcata and the Blue Lake Rancheria in California and other sites. And I highlight this because it's these kinds of partnerships that allow us, less than 1% of global emissions, to not only play a bigger role at home, but also play a global role in bringing clean energy. And with that, let me stop and thank you.
So I'll note Dan's rather broad reach. My center has been working with his lab on mapping basically every city in California for a whole set of criteria for where you would place infrastructure for electric vehicle charging in underserved communities. Just one of many Dan's projects. So what a great panel. Thank you for some inspiration here on Friday afternoon, and wish everybody a great weekend. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.